that were in the rear end housing, all welded up and smoothed out now. It's time to move on to getting the brake brackets figured out. I've got the hubs taken off. I need to take them apart, clean them up. The big thing is I need to switch over to these 1.25" wide rotors from the, I'm guessing 810 wide rotors that are currently on here. The big thing is I want to go to the bigger, wider rotor because they're cheap, and it makes it real easy to use some of these outlaw calipers, which are the same as like a Wilwood Superlight. There's 20 different companies that make copies of it. They're really easy to find for cheap off of eBay or from any like used Circle Track supply place or a swap meet. I've bought some calipers from all of those before, and they're real easy to get into. Like, you can buy them for a fraction of the price of new. You take them apart, you clean them, you pop some new seals in them, you're into them for like an extra 50 bucks to rebuild a pair, and now you've got a good race quality caliper that's going to last a full season before you need to put seals in it again. So I like doing this. I also make my own brake caliper brackets. Like these that I cut out from 1/4" plate. They don't have any holes in them because what we'll do is we'll get everything swapped out and I'll position it all on the rear end and then weld these things on. Worth noting that because they're Superlight style caliper, you can purchase brackets like this that have like a nut welded onto them that are threaded. We'll be placing these, center punching them, drilling and tapping them, and then possibly adding a nut to the back side. I have done these out of 3/8 and haven't bothered adding a nut because I'm going with 1/4" on these. I might add a nut just for a little extra thread engagement. So I did pick up this rear end, used obviously by the condition of the parts. I'm going to be cleaning up everything here. I'm going to get the rotors off, the flange that holds the rotor to the hub, that can also come off, and I can just kind of clean all of that separately, maybe shoot some paint on it, get all the little grease cleaned out, pull the bearings, seals out. I'll probably want to put new seals on, make sure the bearings are good and all that. I might as well take care of all that now before positioning the brake caliper brackets and getting all that welded on, because I really don't want to have to take these apart again later. I will need to change the bolt pattern. However, rather than weld on these steel hubs and re-drill them, which I certainly could do, I have enough room to this O-ring in here to go down to the 4 3/4 bolt pattern versus this 5-on-5. However, I do believe I'm going to have to end up spacing the wheels out to match the front end of the car, so we'll end up with a 1 to 2 inch thick spacer on here anyway, so I might as well leave the big studs on here. We'll be able to put a nice big like shouldered nut I can custom make to hold those on, and then they'll hold the studs that convert to our wheels, so everything will be real nice and solid with that. And it's just the easier, less labor-intensive way to go about this right now, because at some point down the road, more likely than not, I'll end up putting cambered snout ends on this rear end, in which case I'll probably have to run different hubs completely anyway. So this is just a matter of getting me by on a budget for now. Must have been leaking pretty bad because all the bolts are full of grease and stuff on the heads. It can hurt to get the wrench in there. So if you ever run into this, use the air to blow them out. Well, this isn't a great sign. That race is spinning. Actually, all of them are in both hubs. I already pulled them out of the second hub, and definitely you can see the marks on here that they have been spinning. It's also pretty obvious from the wear that's shined that layer you can see there. It looks like somebody tried to stake it before. Obviously that didn't work. I mean, they're not loose in there, but reassembly probably need to be Loctited in. So normally I like to heat parts up a little bit before I paint them, but as I was starting to heat these things up with a little torch there, a little propane torch, they started sweating. So there's like some moisture soaked into them, so I want to make sure I heat that up out. I can't find my rosebud right now, but I'm just going to heat them up with a torch here a little bit just to put some heat in them. Make sure that moisture comes out, and then when you shoot paint on, when they're nice and hot, it sticks really good. These rotors can be mounted either way. They're straight vane, so they're not directional, but they're machined so that this side can sit flat or this side can sit flat. The old rotor was put on there this way. I don't know if that was for just giving it some height as far as where the bracket ended up. It also puts the weight a little bit more inboard. We're not really too concerned about any of that, so I guess my question is whether or not the inside lines up tight with anything as far as on the star, which it does not. This has a little bit of play on there, so it will be located based on the bolts. If it did fit tight to this machined ring, I would use that just as a little bit more of a way of keeping it centered and taking some of any loads like that. So what I don't like about this not being located is you gotta be careful about whether or not this thing's gonna be on center, because it's got just a little bit of play in it, which probably not enough to really matter. However, want to be as close as possible. Alright, not being happy with how much slop there was, I made 2 alignment pins, and now got maybe a couple of thou of movement in there. It's definitely not much. You can check it here. Got 4 thou. So that's a hell of a lot better than the 30 thou that it was moving. So I'm happy with that. I can bolt this thing down and I know that it's going to be close to being centered. I was going to flip this over though, because the way it was mounted last time, had the rotors on like this, and that provides a little more surface contact area between this adapter and the rotor, so I guess we'll just put them on the same way. I just verified with the caliper from this inside bore to the outside edge in 4 places. We got a maximum of 15 thou different, which means that rotor is about 7.5 off perfect center line, so that's pretty darn good. So the trick with mounting these brakes is going to be getting the pads lined up with the rotor. I know that I'm going to have the coil over to the back, so I'm probably going to want the caliper to the front side. So we'll tip this rear end down to where we can have it. Yeah, this is the caliper for the driver's side. So the bleeders will need to be up, but it's alright. We got that one. They're symmetrical, so it doesn't matter which one you use. I've used the same one to do both sides before. So right now, if you can see, we got about a 1/4 inch step from the top of the rotor to the top of the pad. So what I'm going to do here is going to lift that up about where I want it, get it kind of flush, or maybe just below flush, so we're riding on the solid and not the chamfer. Yeah, sometimes the pads will hold. So now I can kind of just lock it in place. I don't know if this one's gonna move because this one was full of brake fluid, but I can see that we're pushed out a little bit on this side, so we're not getting centered up anyway. Weirdly enough, this is usually easier with sticky calipers. I haven't even rebuilt these, but they're full of brake fluid, so they're probably in good shape yet. So now I've got it shimmed up where I want it. Now the next thing is going to be to make sure that we got any twist out of it and that we're centered. Again, it's not extremely critical. Now with the bracket welded on, we'll be able to reassemble it, transfer punch the holes, and then I can drill and tap the flange. Probably add some nuts to the back sides. Caliper sits out here, so the bolt will go through. From the inside, we'll add some nut just for a little extra thread engagement. Weld those on, and then because I got a ton of clearance back here, I'll probably put one gusset off the back. I have done this before without the gusset. I've also done it with 3/8 thick flange. Seems like that's kind of a lot of overkill. You're not getting a ton of braking force in the rear, especially compared to the front. And on the front, I've used 5/16 and 3/8 as far as brackets go. I like using the 3/8 on the front just for a little extra, especially when you're threading into them. Otherwise, with the back, 1/4 inch will be plenty good. There's some brake brackets out there that you can order, and they're only like 1/8 inch bent piece of steel. So it'll have a little of a gusset built into it. However, I have broken one of those after a couple years of abuse on it. That was one that also had lightning holes in it. So by going with the 1/4 inch solid, we're gonna have plenty of strength in that. And as long as you get good weld penetration, that's the key. And if you're ever concerned about your weld penetration, like that first bead I went on there, it was pretty small. So I've done a second pass over the top. Basically made that weld bead 3 times as wide. Was able to just crank up the heat and pour some wire into it. Now the only thing I got to worry about is if it bends a little bit one way or the other, which is why we'll go back, check fit. If it is off, I can actually hit it with a hammer a little bit and just kind of get it straightened out. The thing with the brake and the alignment is just, you don't have to be perfectly accurate with these, because while it might be a little bit of a reduction in brake force right off the bat, wherever this thing ends up, it could be even if it's cocked, as soon as you use it for a little bit and those pads wear in, you're getting full use of the brake pad anyway. But try to make it as close as possible right off the bat, and you'll reduce that break-in period. Start by center punching just one of the holes. That way you can bolt it up and make sure that caliper's not wiggling around on your fairly loose setup, to be honest, for setting the second hole. That way you know the bolt holes are going to line up, versus trying to center punch two of them and then having some error in there and then having trouble getting the holes to line up. But as you can see, we're being held at a pretty good height with where that first hole came out. We might be just a little bit to the outside edge, which is okay. I'd rather have that than the other direction, because what we can do is, because we're bolted to the end of the bracket there, we can shim it out a little. And that's just a matter of getting some, I think they call them machine washers. You can get them in different thicknesses. They're more of a precision size washer. And if you even need to do that much, because like I said, you don't have to be perfect on that, as long as nothing's rubbing and that you're not bottomed out on one side with the pad and pistons and it's rubbing the rotor, in which case you can't disengage it anymore. Once you press on the brake pedal, it's going to move them pistons to where it averages out, and that's where it's going to be happy. I also love using these flange bolts for this. Nothing to it. So this is what I'm talking about. I got a little drag on here, so I should be able to shim it in just a little bit to make it work. Much better. Now I got a little bit of gap behind the pads on each side, and those were a 75 thou shim. So nothing super critical. I mean, 75 is a pretty big change, and you know, it looks like it might be ever so slightly inside now, but everything spins nice and free. We're good enough to go racing with. The brake line tabs should be the last thing that needs to be done. However, I'm gonna wait on these until I get this axle back in the chassis to really kind of look at it, because I'm gonna want to put a little bit of a loop in this, but I don't want to be at risk of hitting the wheel. This should be plenty far enough back. This brake is actually way inboard. But you know, if I went to the back side of the axle, we might have the frame coming down on here. If I went to the front, you know, we might be running into problems with the lower control arm. You know, and I don't want to go too far. I mean, this might be a viable option going in here. We want to have enough slack in here that we can still remove the brake caliper without having to disconnect a line, just in case we got to do some maintenance or change a bearing or anything like that. I don't want to have to re-bleed the brakes, but we also don't want so much bound up in here that we're going to have a rub issue on the line.